Number 1. The dark oxygen hypothesis. Picture yourself 4,000 meters down in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, a stretch of abyssal plain 4.5 million square kilometers wide between Hawaii and Mexico. There's no light here. There's never been light here. And by every rule in the textbook, there should be no oxygen being made here either. Yet in July of 2024, a marine scientist named Andrew Sweetman published a paper in Nature Geoscience that broke that rule. His sealed chambers on the seafloor were not losing oxygen, they were gaining it. Sweetman first saw these readings back in 2013. He assumed his sensors were broken, he recalibrated, he replaced, he repeated the measurement for nearly a decade, and the oxygen kept rising in the dark. The suspect sitting on that seafloor was the polymetallic nodule, a potato-sized lump of manganese, iron, cobalt, nickel, and copper that takes millions of years to grow just a few millimeters. When his team measured the surfaces of these nodules, they found voltages of nearly 1 volt. Working with the chemist Franz Geiger at Northwestern, they proposed that clustered nodules could act like a natural battery, reaching the roughly 1.5 volts needed to split seawater into hydrogen and oxygen. Think about what that means. Every breath you take traces back to photosynthesis, to sunlight captured by life. The Great Oxidation Event, 2.4 billion years ago, filled our air with oxygen through cyanobacteria soaking up light. Dark oxygen would be a second pathway, a way to make the gas of life with no sunlight and no living thing involved at all. It would change how we think about the origin of breathing, and where we might find life on ocean moons like Europa and Enceladus. Here's the tension. That same zone holds the richest known reserves of battery metals on the planet, and mining companies want them. So the science arrived with enemies. At least 5 rebuttal papers followed, some backed by mining interests, arguing the signal came from trapped air bubbles or faulty calibration. Sweetman returned to sea in 2025 to test it again. So you're left with 3 possibilities. The mainstream reading that nodule voltage really is splitting water. The skeptical reading that it is an artifact of the equipment. And the unsettling one that the seafloor is a vast chemical engine we never knew was running. And if we miss something that fundamental, what else are we failing to see? Number 2, the shadow biosphere hypothesis. That last question has a darker cousin. What if we are failing to see not just a chemical process, but an entire form of life? In the mid-2000s, the astrobiologists Carol Cleland and Shelley Copley at the University of Colorado gave a name to an idea that should disturb anyone who trusts a microscope. They called it the shadow biosphere. The proposal is simple and staggering. Life may have begun on Earth more than once, and a second independent origin could still be here, living all around us, invisible. Everything we call living shares the same deep machinery, the same DNA and RNA, the same 20 amino acids, the same energy molecule, ATP, the same left-handed twist to its building blocks. A shadow biosphere would break that pattern. It might use the opposite-handedness, or different amino acids, or swap an element like arsenic for phosphorus. And here's the part that keeps astrobiologists awake. Every tool we use to detect microbes, our culture dishes, our DNA stains, our genetic amplifiers, is designed to find life like ours. Point those tools at alien life, and they would register nothing at all. The physicist Paul Davies pushed this hard in his book, The Eerie Silence. Before we search distant planets, he argued we should search our own because we may have never actually looked. And where would such life hide? The deep ocean is the obvious refuge. Hydrothermal vents, sealed anoxic basins, the crust beneath the seafloor. These places are energy-rich, isolated, and barely sampled. We already know that something like 99% of microbes cannot be grown in a lab. Scientists call that microbial dark matter. Deep life surveys keep pulling up DNA that does not fit neatly onto the known tree of life. In 2010, a team claimed a bacterium from Mono Lake could build its DNA with arsenic. The claim was later refuted, but it lit a fire under the whole field because it asked the right question. In 2007, the United States National Research Council issued a report on so-called weird life and the limits of what we assume biology must be. So consider 3 ways to read this: the mainstream view that all life shares one origin and one chemistry, the expanding view that there are undiscovered lineages but still within familiar chemistry, and the shadow view, a parallel biosphere with alien biochemistry sharing our water unseen. The fear here is not that the evidence says yes, it is that we have never built the instrument that could say no. And what does it mean if life is not even rare, but capable of turning on itself? Number 3, the Medea Hypothesis. We tend to imagine nature as nurturing, a system that balances and heals itself. In 2009, the paleontologist Peter Ward at the University of Washington published a book that took that comfort and inverted it. He named it after Medea, the figure in Greek myth who murdered her own children. The Medea Hypothesis argues that life is not fundamentally nurturing at all. Life, Ward says, is inherently self-destructive, biased again and again toward poisoning its own world. The idea is a direct answer to James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis from the 1970s, which held that life works to keep the planet comfortable for living things. Ward looked at the same history and saw the opposite. Most mass extinctions, he argued, were not caused by asteroids falling from the sky. They were caused by life itself, working through the chemistry of the ocean. The very first catastrophe was the Great Oxidation Event 2.4 billion years ago, when cyanobacteria flooded an oxygen-free world with what was, to most organisms then alive, a deadly poison. He traces the pattern forward. Microbes that make methane and microbes that breathe sulfate are tied to the greenhouse and oxygen-starved oceans behind later die-offs. The end Permian extinction, the worst in Earth's history, he frames in part as a microbial event, the sea-breeding poison. Ward goes further and argues that the total mass of life and its diversity have been trending downward over the long sweep of deep time, and that life keeps shortening its own habitable window. By his reckoning, photosynthesis itself is a slow trap, pulling carbon dioxide out of the air over hundreds of millions of years until plants eventually starve. This is not a popular view among biologists, and that is part of why it matters. It forces a hard look at the assumption that there is a balance of nature waiting to save us. Ward also worked with the astronomer Donald Brownlee on the book Rare Earth, which gives the Medea idea a cosmic edge. Perhaps biospheres routinely engineer their own collapse, which would help explain why the universe seems so silent. So weigh the three positions. The mainstream, that extinctions are mostly triggered from outside. Gaia, that life stabilizes the planet. And Medea, that life is quietly suicidal using the ocean as its weapon. If that is true, the current crisis is not an accident. It is the pattern repeating. And it raises a stranger question still. Where did this self-destructive life actually begin? Number 4. The Deep Hot Biosphere. The answer might not be in sunlit water at all. It might be kilometers underground. In 1999, the Cornell astrophysicist Thomas Gold published a book called The Deep Hot Biosphere, and its central claim was that a vast world of microbial life exists deep inside Earth's crust, possibly outweighing every plant and animal on the surface combined. Gold suggested life may have originated down there in hot rock, feeding on chemical energy, never needing the sun at all. Then he made a claim that put him at war with mainstream geology. He argued that oil and natural gas are not the crushed remains of ancient life, but primordial material made deep within the earth. This abiogenic petroleum idea drew on older Soviet and Ukrainian theories. Gold predicted that microbes would be found living off these upwelling hydrocarbons, leaving a biological fingerprint in the oil. A test well drilled into the Siljan Ring crater in Sweden in the 1980s recovered some oil and a microbial sludge, but the result was economically inconclusive, and geologists still reject abiogenic oil for the deposits we actually drill, pointing to clear biological markers. But here's the twist that makes gold impossible to dismiss. The broader idea of a deep living world has been spectacularly confirmed. Drilling has found life down to roughly 5 kilometers, at temperatures as high as 122 degrees Celsius. In 2018, the Deep Carbon Observatory estimated that the deep subsurface holds between 15 and 23 billion tons of carbon locked in microbial life, hundreds of times the carbon mass of all humanity. As much as 70% of all bacteria and archaea may live beneath our feet, much of it under the seafloor. These are not ordinary microbes. Some divide perhaps once every few centuries or even millennia. In 2020, scientists revived microbes from sub-seafloor sediment roughly 100 million years old. They survive on rock chemistry and hydrogen, fully independent of the sun. Gold believes such hidden biospheres could exist inside other planets and moons, making buried life a galactic norm. So separate the two threads. The mainstream accepts a real deep biosphere but keeps oil biological. Gold tied both together, deep life and abiogenic oil. And the furthest extension imagines a crustal majority of life quietly governing the planet's carbon from below. Either way, the boundary between geology and biology dissolves, and the crust itself begins to look alive. The unsettling lesson is how badly we have underestimated where life can hold on, and if life can survive that, the ocean can also turn against it. Number 5, the Canfield Ocean. So far, the threats have been hidden life. Now the ocean itself becomes the killer. In 1998, the Danish geochemist Donald Canfield proposed that for much of Earth's middle history, the deep ocean was not oxygenated at all. It was anoxic and full of hydrogen sulfide, the gas that smells of rotten eggs. Scientists call this state euxenia. In such water, green and purple sulfur bacteria thrive, using sulfide instead of water to photosynthesize, and they can turn the whole sea a murky purple-green. The geoscientist Lee Kump at Penn State took this state and turned it into a murder weapon. In 2005, he proposed that a euxinic ocean would not keep its poison to itself. It would belch hydrogen sulfide into the atmosphere. His target was the end Permian extinction, the Great Dying, 252 million years ago, when roughly 90% of marine species vanished. The sequence runs like this: the planet warms, the ocean stops mixing and stratifies, the deep loses its oxygen, sulfur bacteria bloom, and toxic hydrogen sulfide rises out of the water to gas the life on land and in the shallows, while also tearing at the ozone layer and letting in lethal ultraviolet light. The evidence is chemical. Rocks from that age carry biomarkers of green sulfur bacteria, molecules called isori nyer-atane, which means sulfidic water reached all the way up into the sunlit zone. The trigger was the Siberian Traps, a colossal volcanic eruption, but Kump's mechanism is the kill switch that finished the job. Hydrogen sulfide becomes acutely lethal to animals at concentrations of just 700 to 1,000 parts per million. Similar euxinic conditions appear in other ocean anoxic events, in the late Devonian and the Cretaceous. Now the part that keeps scientists awake. Warming reduces how much oxygen seawater can hold, and it increases stratification. Those are the same precursors. Today's expanding dead zones and oxygen minimum zones are sometimes read as small-scale previews. The Black Sea is the largest modern eutinic basin, anoxic and sulfidic below roughly 150 to 200 meters, a living model of a Canfield Ocean. Kump himself cautions that a full global euxinic event would need extreme, sustained warming far beyond what we project, so hold the three readings: the mainstream, that the Siberian Traps and many stresses did the killing, Kump and Canfield, that euxinic hydrogen sulfide was the primary executioner, and the extrapolation, that modern warming nudges us, however slightly, back toward that switch. The killer is invisible, chemical, and it rises from the deep. But the ocean does not only poison, sometimes it strikes. Number 6. The submarine landslide Mega-Tsunami theory. Stand on a quiet shore, the water is calm. Nothing on the surface warns you that, far offshore and far below, an entire mountainside of sediment is about to let go. Underwater landslides can displace staggering volumes of water, and in the right conditions, they can generate waves larger than many earthquakes ever could. The classic case is the Storegga slide off the coast of Norway around 8,200 years ago, when roughly 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment collapsed down the continental slope. The tsunami that followed sent waves of 3 to 6 meters and locally as high as 20 meters, racing across the North Atlantic. It is thought to have drowned Doggerland, the low land bridge that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Geologists have found the tsunami's deposits in Scotland, Norway, the Faroe Islands, and as far away as Greenland. These slides are triggered by earthquakes, by sediment piling up too fast, and by the breakdown of frozen methane hydrates in the seabed. Then there is the controversial one. In 2001, Stephen Ward and Simon Day modeled a possible collapse of the Cumbre Vieja volcano on La Palma in the Canary Islands. They imagined roughly 500 cubic kilometers of rock failing at once, throwing up a dome of water hundreds of meters high, with waves still tens of meters tall when they reach the Americas hours later. A true ocean-crossing mega-tsunami. Many geologists pushed back hard, arguing the flank would fail in pieces, not a single block, which would shrink the wave dramatically. History shows the raw power is real. In 1958, a rockslide into Lituya Bay in Alaska produced a wave that ran up 524 meters, the tallest ever recorded. In 1998, a submarine slump off Papua New Guinea killed around 2,200 people. In 1929, a slide off the Grand Banks snapped transatlantic cables one after another and killed 28 people in Newfoundland. And in 2018, the collapse of Anak Krakatau in Indonesia killed more than 400, with no earthquake to warn anyone. That is the real horror. Landslide tsunamis often give no seismic warning at all, so our quake-based alarm systems can miss them completely. So weigh it. The mainstream sees a real but rarer ocean crossing risk. Ward and Day see catastrophic collapse. The skeptics see fragmented failure and a smaller wave. Either way, quiet slopes sit loaded, waiting. And the ocean has slower ways to turn on us too. Number 7. The Thermohaline Shutdown. Follow a single parcel of warm water north along the surface of the Atlantic. This is the Great Conveyor, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which includes the Gulf Stream. It carries warmth toward Europe, and the whole system is driven by something called thermohaline forcing, a combination of temperature and salinity that controls how dense the water is. Near Greenland, that warm, salty water cools, grows heavy, and sinks into the deep. That sinking is the engine that pulls the entire conveyor along. Now add fresh water. As Greenland's ice melts and rainfall increases, the surface of the North Atlantic grows fresher and less dense. If it cannot sink, the engine stalls. A collapse could cool northwestern Europe by several degrees and scramble rainfall patterns for billions of people. We know this can happen fast because it has. Around 12,900 years ago, during the Younger Dryas, a surge of meltwater is thought to have slowed this circulation and refroze the northern hemisphere within mere decades. Ice cores record many such abrupt flips called Dansgaard-Oeschger events, happening on the timescale of a human lifetime. The modern signs are concerning. A study in 2018 and another in 2021 reported that the circulation is at its weakest in over 1,000 years and may be losing stability. In 2023, two researchers, Peter and Suzanne Didlevson, published a controversial estimate that a collapse could come as early as the middle of this century, with a central guess around 2057, though the uncertainty is enormous. The official assessment from the climate panel is that an abrupt collapse this century is unlikely, but they pointedly do not rule it out, and they treat it as a major tipping point. The oceanographer Wallace Broker called this conveyor the climate's Achilles heel decades ago. A shutdown would not be the instant ice age of the movies, but it could mean severe, rapid regional cooling, shifted monsoons, lower crop yields, surging seas on the United States East Coast, and stress on the Amazon. Since 2004, an array of instruments strung across the Atlantic at 26 degrees north has measured the system directly and recorded its weakening. The deep part, where North Atlantic water forms and sinks, is the hardest piece to watch. So 3 readings again. The mainstream, weakening is likely, but collapse unlikely soon. The Didlevsons, that collapse may be closer than we think. And the paleoclimate view, that abrupt flips are simply what this ocean does. The trigger is already growing, and the ocean has frozen completely before. Number 8, the Snowball Earth Hypothesis. Imagine standing at the equator and seeing nothing but ice in every direction. According to one of the boldest ideas in Earth science, that is exactly how the planet once looked. In 1992, the Caltech geobiologist Joseph Kirschvink coined the term Snowball Earth. 6 years later, Paul Hoffman and Daniel Schrag at Harvard laid out the full case in a landmark paper, arguing that during 2 great glaciations, the Sturtienne and the Marinoan, between roughly 717 and 635 million years ago, the oceans froze over from pole to pole. The evidence is written in the rocks. Glacial deposits called tillites turn up at latitudes that were tropical at the time, which means ice reached the equator. Strange carbonate layers called cap carbonates sit directly on top of these glacial beds and record an abrupt, extreme thaw. Banded iron formations reappear in this interval, a sign that the ice-covered oceans had lost their oxygen, letting dissolved iron build up. The likely trigger was the supercontinent Rodinia sitting near the equator, where intense weathering pulled carbon dioxide out of the air and cooled the planet. What turned a cold snap into a catastrophe was a feedback loop. Ice reflects sunlight, which cools the planet, which grows more ice, which reflects still more sunlight. Models suggest that once ice pushed past about 30 degrees latitude, the freeze could cascade all the way to the equator within centuries. Escaping it took millions of years because with the ocean sealed under ice, the weathering that normally removes carbon dioxide stopped, and a volcanic gas slowly built into a runaway greenhouse that finally melted everything in a violent thaw, possibly spiking temperatures toward 50 degrees Celsius. Not everyone accepts a total freeze. A variant called slushball Earth argues a thin band of open water survived near the equator, keeping photosynthetic life alive. What is striking is the timing. These deep freezes come just before the Ediacaran and the Cambrian explosion of complex animals, so the crisis may have driven evolution forward. Kirschvink even linked these episodes to the rise of oxygen and the dawn of multicellular life. So 3 readings: the hard snowball of Hoffman, the partial slush ball, and the uneasy extrapolation that the same ice-albedo feedback is still wired into the planet today. The lesson is that Earth has 2 stable states, temperate and frozen, with a tipping point between them. But ice can collapse just as violently as it forms. Number 9. The marine ice sheet instability. Travel now beneath a glacier the size of Britain, riding a robot into the dark cavity where ice meets the sea. This is Thwaites in West Antarctica, and it has earned a grim nickname, the Doomsday Glacier. The fear is built on an idea called marine ice sheet instability. When an ice sheet sits on bedrock that lies below sea level and slopes downward inland, its retreat can become a runaway. As the grounding line, where ice lifts off the bed, pulls back, it exposes ever thicker ice, which flows out faster, which pulls the line back further still. The warning is old. In 1978, the glaciologist John Mercer cautioned that West Antarctica was uniquely vulnerable to rapid collapse. Today, Thwaites already contributes about 4% of global sea level rise, and its outflow has doubled since the 1990s. The driver is the deep ocean. Warm circumpolar deep water pushes underneath the floating ice shelf and melts the glacier from below, right at the grounding zone. In 2018, an international team sent a robot called Icefin under the shelf to watch this melting directly, and a few years later they warned that the eastern ice shelf, which braces the glacier like a cork, could shatter within years to a decade. The numbers are stark. Thwaites alone holds enough ice to raise global sea level by about 65 centimeters, and it acts as a plug for the wider West Antarctic ice sheet, whose full collapse would raise seas by roughly 3.3 meters over centuries. There's an even more extreme idea on the table. In 2016, Robert DeCanto and David Pollard proposed marine ice cliff instability, in which tall, exposed cliffs of ice simply fail under their own weight, accelerating collapse dramatically. That idea is debated, and some later studies suggest it was overstated, but it remains a haunting worst case. What makes this a sleepless night problem is the word commitment. Once the runaway begins, it may continue even if the warming that started it stops. Satellites that weigh the ice from orbit show mass loss accelerating across the Amundsen Sea sector, and the hidden ocean cavity beneath the shelf remains brutally hard to observe. Tipping estimates cluster around 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, within the range we are already approaching. So 3 readings. The mainstream, that the instability is real but the timing uncertain. DeCanto and Pollard, that cliff failure could speed it up this century. And the skeptics, that the cliff scenario is overstated. Warm, unmonitored, deep water connects directly to the height of the sea at your city. And there is one fate even larger, where the ocean does not rise but disappears. Number 10. The Runaway Greenhouse. Look up at Venus, and you are looking at a warning. The runaway greenhouse is a state in which warming evaporates water, and because water vapor is itself a powerful greenhouse gas, it traps more heat, which evaporates more water, in a loop that feeds on itself. Taken to its endpoint, the oceans evaporate entirely, and the water escapes into space, leaving a parched and lifeless world. Venus, almost exactly Earth's size, very likely had water early in its history. Today, its surface sits at around 400 to 65 degrees Celsius under a crushing atmosphere. The theory took shape across the 20th century. In 1969, Andrew Ingersoll modeled how Venus could have run away, and later, James Casting worked out where the edges of a star's habitable zone must lie. There is a gentler version called the moist greenhouse, in which the upper atmosphere becomes humid and the planet bleeds its water into space slowly over time. In a true runaway, water vapor rises high enough that ultraviolet light splits it apart, hydrogen escapes, and the oceans are removed permanently. Venus carries the fingerprint of exactly this. Its high ratio of deuterium to ordinary hydrogen is the chemical ghost of a vanished ocean. Here is the part that is not optional. The sun has grown roughly 30% brighter since Earth formed, and it keeps brightening. On a timescale of 1 to 2 billion years, that rising output is expected to push Earth itself into a moist or runaway state, ending the biosphere no matter what we do. Casting and colleagues estimate the oceans will begin a serious loss as the sun strengthens. Researchers have asked whether human carbon dioxide alone could trigger a runaway now, and the consensus is reassuring on that narrow point. Our emissions cannot boil the oceans away, though they certainly accelerate warming. A study in 2013 by Jeremy LeConte and colleagues did suggest the runaway threshold may be lower than older estimates, tightening the inner edge of the habitable zone. The deep ocean is central to all of this because it stores most of the planet's surface water and heat, and its eventual evaporation is the final state. The same threshold defines which distant exoplanets could hold liquid water and life, and it is effectively irreversible. Oceans lost to space do not come back. So 3 readings: the mainstream, that this is a far future sun-driven fate, not a near-term human one; the cautious, that a lower threshold should sober us; and the anxious fringe, that compounding feedbacks might bring some version of it forward. It is the one scenario where the ocean, the very thing that defines our world, simply ceases to exist. Step back from all 10 and a single shape emerges from the dark. Almost every one of these theories runs on the same kind of engine, a feedback that amplifies itself. In the Snowball and in Thwaites, it is the ice albedo feedback, white surfaces reflecting heat and growing colder. In the Runaway Greenhouse, it is the water vapor feedback, heat-lifting moisture that traps more heat. In the Canfield Ocean, it is stratification and the loss of oxygen feeding the bloom of poison. In the conveyor shutdown, it is fresh water lowering density and choking the sinking that drives the whole system. A tipping point is simply a threshold beyond which change no longer needs a push. It carries itself. Many of these systems also show hysteresis, which means that once you cross the line, going back is far harder than the way in, and sometimes impossible on any timescale that matters to us. That is why these scenarios are so frightening. They do not move in gentle, predictable slopes. They lurch. They flip. And the deep ocean is the slow, hidden reservoir at the center of it, quietly storing heat and carbon and change until the moment it releases them. Paleoclimate is the laboratory that proves these thresholds are not hypothetical. The planet has crossed them before, and the rocks remember. In 2008, a team led by Timothy Lenton formalized the idea of tipping elements in the climate system, and several of the items on this list appear on that map. The common warning is the same. Our intuition expects the world to respond in proportion to what we do to it. The ocean does not promise that. It can sit still for a long time and then move all at once faster than we can react. Which raises the obvious question: if these systems are so consequential, why can we not simply go and check them? The answer is that we have barely looked. Even now, around 80% of the ocean floor has never been mapped in high resolution, which is why an international effort called Seabed 2030 exists to finish the job. Compare that to the fact that we have better maps of the surfaces of the Moon and Mars than of our own seabed, and the scale of our ignorance starts to land. The deep resists us physically. At the bottom of the deepest trenches, pressure exceeds 1,000 atmospheres, enough to crush most instruments we try to send down. Sunlight fades to nothing by around 1,000 meters, so the majority of the ocean exists in permanent darkness. The places that matter most to these theories are often the least reachable of all: the cavity beneath the Thwaites ice shelf, the rock kilometers below the seafloor where the deep biosphere lives. We end up studying what we can get to, not necessarily what is most important, a bias baked into the cost and rarity of submersibles and deep drilling. This is why the same uneasy phrase keeps returning across every item. We cannot rule it out. It is not a rhetorical flourish. It is an honest description of a science operating with a thin sliver of the evidence it needs. Robots like Icefin and the growing fleet of remotely operated vehicles are slowly extending our reach frame by frame, dive by dive. But the gap remains vast, and that gap is itself the source of the fear. The unknown here is not a small footnote. It is most of the planet's habitable volume. The deep does not just hide monsters, it hides mechanisms, the levers that move the whole Earth. And yet, for all that uncertainty, some of these triggers have already been pulled. It would be easy to file these ideas under speculation and sleep soundly. The trouble is that several of them are not speculation at all. They are history. The Great Oxidation Event genuinely happened, and oxygen genuinely was the planet's first global pollutant, lethal to most of the life that existed when it arrived. The end Permian Oxyneer is the closest thing we have to a realized Canfield Ocean, and it really did help erase about 9 in 10 marine species. The Starega slide was not a model. It was a wave that crossed the North Atlantic and helped to drown an inhabited landscape. The Younger Dryas was not a thought experiment. It was an abrupt circulation flip that refroze half the world in decades. The Sturtian and Marinoan glaciations left their fingerprints in tropical rock, proof that the oceans really did freeze. Each of these is a proof of concept, a demonstration that the Earth system can and does shift between radically different states. That is what makes them so much more chilling than a simple maybe. The pattern is not that these things could happen. It is that they have happened repeatedly, and the ocean has flipped its state more than once. There is also a sobering lesson in the timing. Some of these transitions unfolded over millions of years, but others, like the Younger Dryas, took only decades, well within the span of a single human life. The geological record is not always a story of slow, gentle change. Sometimes it is a record of doors slamming shut. The crucial difference now is the trigger. In the past, the push came from volcanoes, from continental drift, from slow changes in the sun. Today, for the first time, one of the forces capable of nudging these systems is us, through warming, through deoxygenation, through the disturbance of the seabed itself. We are not outside these feedback loops watching them from a safe distance. We are inside them, adding heat and carbon to a reservoir that has shown again and again that it can hold change quietly and then release it all at once. So the real question is not whether the ocean can change the world. It is how close we are now, and what evidence would actually tell us. Science earns trust by trying to break its own best ideas, so it is worth asking what would settle each of these. For dark oxygen, the test is independent reproduction on the seafloor, ruling out trapped bubbles and sensor artifacts once and for all. For the shadow biosphere, it would take an assay that searches directly for the wrong chirality or an unexplained chemistry, an instrument finally built to detect life unlike ours, rather than ignore it. For the Medea Hypothesis, the path forward is better accounting, carefully separating extinctions driven by life's own chemistry from those triggered by asteroids and volcanoes. For the Deep Hot Biosphere, it means settling the isotope debate over where hydrocarbons truly come from, and mapping just how much living mass hides in the crust. For the Canfield Ocean, researchers want firm thresholds, how much warming and how much oxygen loss it would actually take to approach Euxenia in the real modern sea. For the submarine landslide, the answer is monitoring, watching unstable slopes in real time, and modeling whether they fail all at once or piece by piece. For the conveyor, it is the slow accumulation of direct measurements of the overturning itself, rather than indirect proxies to locate the threshold before we reach it. For the Snowball, the Glacier, and the Runaway, it is a marriage of paleoclimate constraints with hard observation of the warm water now attacking Antarctica from below. Better robots, sharper satellites like the ones that measure sea surface height and gravity, and deeper drilling are all narrowing the gap. None of these theories is meant to be believed on faith. Each one is a target, waiting for the evidence that will confirm it or kill it. And while we wait, we have to decide how to live with not knowing. Notice what was never on this list. There were no sea monsters, no krakens, no creatures with too many teeth. The fear in every one of these theories is colder and stranger than that. It is mechanism, chemistry, physics, feedback loops that do not care whether we are watching. The deep ocean turns out to be both the cradle of life and, in scenario after scenario, the thing most capable of ending it. That doubleness is the heart of the unease. What truly keeps scientists awake is not certainty, but its absence. It is the honest admission that we are reasoning about the most powerful systems on the planet from a thin margin of data, and that the systems can move faster than our understanding. Studying the worst cases is not doom for its own sake. It is how we learn which lines not to cross and how to prepare if we cross one anyway. And in several of these stories, we are no longer just observers waiting on nature. We are the hand near the trigger through the metals we want to mine and the heat we keep adding. There's a strange humility in all of this. We belong to a species that has seen more of the surface of the moon than the floor of its own sea. The ocean keeps its theories not because they are unknowable, but because we have barely begun to look. And the very same questions that haunt these depths about where life begins, how worlds die, and what makes a planet habitable are the questions guiding our search for life among the stars. Wonder and dread, it turns out, are two sides of the same dark water. And that water is still down there, vast and patient, waiting to be understood.